Okay, chapter 12. Come, ye thankful people, come. You're looking up suet, which is like something on an animal that you use to bake with and make pastry. You'll read it. And lubricate, like something to grease something up with. Okay, explain how Mrs. Dowdle ended up getting revenge against Roscoe Burdick. You knew she would. Six good sentences. Explain it like if I'd never heard it. Explain it. Chapter 12. Come, ye thankful people, come. Thanksgiving now and Christmas comin'. The last leaves burned in long piles in the ditches. White smoke rose through bare limbs like ancient Kickapoo campfires. The second frost had killed the canas, so there was nothing between us and Mrs. Dowdle. She was too busy to sit down, busier than a one-armed paper hanger, she claimed. I'd die standing up like an old ox, she said, another one of her sayings. She and Ruth Ann had made up little packets of suet to hang in the trees of the yard for the winter birds, the chickadees and cardinals. They tied them up in red and green ribbons like Christmas presents coming early. Now they were running a big lawn roller from somewhere back and forth to haul the black walnut carpeting her yard. Walnuts for cookies to come. They'd cut the sage and hung it in bunches from the cob house beams for Thanksgiving dressing. In her kitchen, wherever the pumpkins weren't, were big dough balls of breadcrumbs drying. For their yard work, Mrs. Dowdle wore a pair of old cotton stockings pulled over her canvas coat sleeves to keep out the draft. Ruth Ann was apt to burst into song while they worked. Jesus wants me for a sunbeam, or we gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. At school, there was a lot of talk about pilgrims, but then there always was this time of year. Mrs. Weidenbach, the banker's wife, came to our class to tell about how either she or one of her ancestors had come over on the Mayflower. One thing I gave thanks for was that Newt Fluke was taken out of the 6th grade. He wasn't doing time, even though Mrs. Dowdle had caught him red-handed. Instead, the coach, who was also the high school principal, promoted Newt to freshman year so he could play out the football season. The coach planned to build a new ground offense around him. And without Newt, Elmo Leeper Jr. wasn't much. In fact, he was kind of lonely. He came over to me one noon and said, "You want to swap lunches?" He held up his bucket. "Mine's peanut butter and grape jelly on Wonder Bread." And I did, because mine was corned beef and carrot sticks. For a preacher's family, Thanksgiving is all about feeding the hungry. Mother and the Methodist Women's Circle used the church as the gathering place for food donations. The church had new top-of-the-line windows, now combination storms and screens. Moore's IGA store donated turkeys, and the DAR brought canned goods. Mrs. Weidenbach herself promised her famous candied yams. I had to beg various stores for boxes to pack the dinners in because we'd be delivering them to shut-ins. Though Mrs. Dowdle was no churchwoman, she was in and out of all Thanksgiving week, gradually taking over the entire Methodist Feed the Hungry Thanksgiving campaign. She was everywhere Mother turned. "Who's baking them turkeys for you?" she demanded to know. When she heard it was Mrs. Pensinger, she said, "Reba Pensinger? Her turkey's dry as the bottom of a canary cage, and you could lubricate your car with her pan gravy. I'll do the bird in my oven. Have this big boy bring them to my house," meaning me. Also, she thought very little of cranberry sauce in a can. "I wouldn't slop hogs with it. You can taste the can." A cauldron of bubbling, popping cranberries and orange peels seethed on her stovetop, spiced with cinnamon sticks. As soon as the school was over every afternoon, Ruth Ann stood on a kitchen chair and stirred. Since Mrs. Pensinger didn't own oven space for the turkeys, she baked 2 or 3 pumpkin pies and brought them over to the church. But she said her pumpkins had let her down, and all the good ones had vanished from her patch. Mrs. Dowdle baked 20 pumpkin pies at least. She showed Ruth Ann how to roll out dough and how to keep a bottom crust from getting soggy in the middle. 3 mountains of dressing grew in her kitchen: chestnut, oyster, and cornbread. The Methodist men volunteered to deliver the dinners on Thanksgiving Day. Brochier's Funeral Home offered their hearse, but Dad thought it might be sending the wrong message to people who saw it turning in at their place. Somehow Mrs. Dowdle was in the car with us when we headed out. She hadn't dressed up. She wore her kitchen apron under her hunting jacket. Ruth Ann was in the back seat with her, also aproned. Dad was behind the wheel, and I sat behind him where I liked to be. The whole pickle smelled like turkey and cranberries and baked this morning Parker House rolls. Mrs. Dowdle gave us the directions to Aunt Madge's house, whoever she was. Mrs. Dowdle had been particular about calling on Aunt Madge. "Who is she, anyway?" Ruth Ann wanted to know. "Is she a poor old widow woman?" "Well, she's poor, all right, and old as the hills," Mrs. Dowdle pondered, "though I don't know as you could call her a widow woman. Nobody in that family ever got around to marrying." Then how is she? Then she's an old maid? Ruth Ann inquired. Well, I don't know as you'd call her that either, Mrs. Dowdle muttered. Dad was all ears for whatever he could hear from up front. We spun along the country road through the frosty fields. I watched him work through the gears on the pickle. He was inclined to ride the clutch a little. Mrs. Dowdle reached up to poke his shoulder. Make a left at that Burma shave sign, preacher. We were about 5 miles now out of town, getting down to one lane, then a track with 2 ruts. Up a turning was what looked like a large junkyard, and the fence was down. Turn up that lane, Mrs. Dowdle directed, and Dad geared down. The house itself lurked low, and the roof was patched with Coca-Cola signs. We all helped to carry Aunt Madge's Thanksgiving dinner. Go on in. She don't lock up. Inside was a lot like outside and somewhat colder. You could see your breath. Dad had to duck in the doorway. The floor wasn't all there. And then over by the stove pile of rags became an old woman in a lazy boy recliner. Hoo boy, Ruth Ann whispered. That's the oldest woman I ever saw. Mrs. Dowdle nodded. She was only about 3 years behind me in school. We had to clear the plank table to put down the boxes of dinner. The old woman noticed us. She had long red nose and kept wiping with a matching bandana. Get off my place, she greeted. Clear out of here. We brought you your Thanksgiving dinner, Mrs. Dowdle bellowed at her. My what? Old Aunt Madge said. It ain't even Thanksgiving. Yes, it is. Aunt Madge squinted up. From the look of you, it's Halloween. Mrs. Dowdle wore her flap cap. Aunt Madge wore a floppy straw hat under her chins with 2 mufflers. Who are you, anyhow? Her eyes were slits. You that big gal who married Dowdle? That's me. You want some chestnut dressing? When did you eat last? I don't know, Aunt Madge said. What day is it? And whose kids are these? Your grandkids? They might be, Mrs. Dowdle said. I'll have this boy stick some more cobs in your stove, meaning me. I don't feel that cold, Aunt Madge said. I'm too old. What's up with this little gal doing? Meaning Ruth Ann. She's dishing up some of Wilhelmina Weidenbach's candied yams for you, but you don't like 'em. They're so sweet, they'd set your teeth on edge if you had any. Where is my teeth? Aunt Madge wondered, looking around. She spied Dad pouring a jar of gravy on the white meat. Who's that old owl hoot? He's the preacher. What's he here for? Well, I brought him to preach your funeral in case you die before we get something to eat in you. Ruth Ann stared at that, and Dad did too. I ain't dying today, Aunt Madge said. I'm waiting for Thanksgiving because they're going to bring me my dinner. Aunt Madge managed to put away a lot of dinner, though she had to gum everything. She wanted seconds on everything except the candied yams, and she wanted a double-wide slice of pie. We were all watching her eat when the sound from outside made us jump. Dad dashed for the doorway and hit his head. I followed. It was the sound of the pickle roaring to life, then the clump of the hood and the bang of a car door. When we looked out, the pickle was wheeling around in the barn lot, throwing gravel. Now it was gunning down the lane and away in a cloud of exhaust. Dad grabbed for his car keys and they were in his pocket. Somebody had hot-wired our pickle and stolen it right out from under our noses. Dad looked really tense. Mrs. Dowdle, behind us, went to the door. Bagged him, she said. This time for sure. I figured he'd be needing another car bad, but he won't get far on an eighth of a tank of gas. She meant Roscoe Burdick. Roscoe Burdick, who'd need wheels because he piled up his own car on the Shella Barker steps and sent Phyllis flying. Come to find out, Aunt Madge was Roscoe's grandma. I counted on temptation overcoming him if we delivered a car right to his doorstep. Mrs. Dowdle sounded about half satisfied. Of course, she hadn't told us this was where Roscoe Burdick lived. Dad and I had to tramp back to the Burma Shave sign on the country road to flag down a ride. In the end, a farmer named Shensbaugh picked us up and brought us all home. Mrs. Dowdle sat in the cab of the truck with him. We Barnharts rode in the truck bed behind, wind whipped all the way back to town. It was really cold back there. Dad held Ruth Ann and wrapped in his arms, but she thought it was just great, like a hayride, though her eyes streamed and her nose was red as Aunt Madge's. She wanted to sing, "Come, ye thankful people, come," trilling it out across the frosty fields. All is safely gathered in ere the winter storms begin. Bye.